I would say it's be present. It's be present in every single situation. We are always finding ourselves in either living in the past, thinking about something that has happened long time ago, or something that happened in something that you just walked out of, or you're at home but you're thinking about what happened at work during that day, or you're thinking about this one bad conversation you had, or we're always sort of stuck thinking about what happened before, or we're stuck in the future where we're worrying about what's going to happen tomorrow. Oh, I still have to pay this bill. Oh, this big presentation is coming up. Oh, I have to do this. Or what will happen if da 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 da. We seem to be so stuck in either things that have already happened and things that still have to happen in the future.
Welcome to the podcast, Dan. I am so excited to have you today. How are you doing?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor. We're doing okay here. We're doing okay.
Are you doing pretty good compared to us?
Yeah, we were just talking a little bit before the podcast. Basically, the situation here, we have a country of about 100 million people, and so
Right.
far we've only had 400 cases. No one has passed away either. So I think generally we're pretty good, but the impact has been there, even though there hasn't maybe been an impact in terms of the numbers of people infected or people, passed away from the disease here. The impact is still there in terms of like people not being able to like freely live in the way that they lived before. Businesses definitely have been impacted, and I think everyone is going to this sort of mass social experiment of trying to figure out what is life like when you're not doing your normal day to day. So the changes have still been pretty significant. Yeah.
Right. And I was reading about how the Vietnam used the tracing technology for the control of the coronavirus, and I was pretty impacted. And like you're talking about impact, I think the impact will be very long lasting, and we would be able to see the impacts for next 5 to 10 years, I believe.
Oh, no, no doubt, for sure.
So, my question for you, the first question that I really, really want to ask you about reading after reading your profile is, how did you find your forte?
That's a good question. Yeah, I would say that like if I look back at sort of the past 10 years, especially, I don't think I've ever done work that I didn't like necessarily. Maybe from like moment to moment or day to day, like there must have been some difficult or like not so fun moments. But I think I've always done what I've loved. But I think only in the last couple of years have I really landed somewhere that I feel like I could call my forte. And I generally think that like in life, you go through these kind of like loops where you start at a certain point and then you sort of like trial and error, learn and experiment, you learn more and more and more until you hit some kind of like epiphany. And then you go into sort of like another loop and you do the same thing all over again. And I think you typically, it's kind of like related with life stages as well, but you have a couple of those moments where you really make sort of bigger jumps than the day-to-day increments. And so I would say for me, if I look back, where I really would say I landed my forte would have been in one of those moments where I realized that the work that I was doing was maybe fun from day to day and it was still interesting, but it wasn't rewarding and meaningful enough. And when I made the transition to what I'm doing right now, I think I really landed on something where I feel like, I would do this even if I wasn't paid for it, right? It really feels much more as like a purpose, as something much more meaningful. Although don't tell my boss that I would do it without pay, of course.
So, another thing I want to ask you is that how do you preach positivity in such tough times and in times we're full of horrifying news around us, and you're still here with me with a smile in your face and giving such positive and lovely vibes?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think the whole idea of positivity, and I've been studying happiness now for a couple of years. The whole idea of positivity, I always thought that you were either an optimist or a pessimist. You were either the kind of person that sees the glass half full or half
Yeah.
empty. And I think over the last couple of years, I've kind of realized, especially studying positive psychology, that that is kind of like a construct that maybe people believe, but really there is something positive in every situation. And I think that like when you really get into it, and you sort of accept the fact, right? It's not about like taking a rose-colored glasses or like taking a more than realistic view. It's just about accepting the fact that, yeah, those bad things are out there, but they're going to be out there regardless of whether you feel positive or not. So I think it's actually much more about taking a really realistic view and saying that like, well, all of that is out there, the good things, the bad things, and then still finding something that's meaningful and positive to you. And so I would say that I'm not ignoring the fact that there's a lot of bad news out there, especially in these times. That's almost impossible to do. But it's sort of just like processing that as a data point, as something that is, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to influence how I feel.
So, as you mentioned, you've been studying happiness for quite a while now. So, what does happiness really mean to you? And I'm sure it must be subjective. Happiness means different to different people. And so, what is it for you?
Oof, that's the big question, right? Like, what is happiness? And you may answer this one as well. I think that it is very subjective. I think it is one of those things that means a lot of things to a lot of people. I think that one of the better explanations of it, and I think like a helpful sort of like framework and construct for people when they're trying to not be happier, but like, or not feel happier, but truly be happier, is to think about happiness as being happy in your life and being happy with your life. So I'm sure you're in college, right, and you're studying. You must have heard of Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow,
Right.
which really gets into kind of like the two brains, right? There's the emotional brain and there's kind of like the rational brain, and the emotional brain really takes 95% of our decisions, right? And he describes in that book, one of the chapters is dedicated to this idea of we sort of have two selves, right? We have the self that lives from moment to moment, and he says that like a moment is about 3 seconds. So in our life, we have about 500 million moments. But those moments are so short that we typically don't really experience them. We kind of like pass them very easily. And then there is sort of like the longer view. And so he says you're kind of like you have that person that lives in the moment and experiences like all these sort of like micro moments in a linear way. And then there is kind of the reflective self. And so that difference between, do I feel happy, kind of like in my life, that is really moment to moment. So that would be if I call you up and say, hey, how are you currently feeling? And you would say, currently feeling 5 out of 10, right? Because I'm sitting at home and I cannot go out and I cannot do the things I want to do, right? Or maybe then a day later I call you and you say, oh, I feel an 8 out of 10 because someone just sent me free milk tea and I'm so happy, right? That is kind of like the moment to moment happiness that can always change. And there's a lot of ways to improve your moment to moment happiness, but it really is sort of like very fragmented and very much dependent on that specific moment. And then you have what he calls sort of the reflective self. And that would be when I have a conversation with someone and I say, when let's take a moment, let's snap out of the moment to moment living. If you reflect on how your life is as a whole, all the good things, all the bad things, all the things that you find challenging, all the things that you really love about your life, how do you feel about your life right now? And then you would say, well, reflecting on everything that's going on right now, I would say I'm kind of like a 7.5 or maybe an 8, or maybe, when things are not going so well, it would be more like a 6. So one of the really great analogies that is used a lot is that, for example, for parents, and we are just having our first baby on the way. So I'm already thinking about what this will be like. For parents, very typically, their happiness moment to moment is not so high, especially new parents, because you have, a baby that doesn't sleep, which means that you don't sleep. And you're very tired and you have a lot of pressures because you still need to go out of your normal life. You still need to go to work. So if you ask any given parent, especially new parents, how happy do you feel in your life moment to moment, they may say, okay, not so happy. But if you ask them, how happy do you feel with your life? And they look back and they say, oh, I feel so rich. I feel so happy because I have this beautiful family. Then I have this like job that feels very meaningful. Then I have this, then I have this. So that happiness is much higher. So typically when I talk about happiness, I would really look at it from both those perspectives. And I think the one that people should focus on, obviously, is that sort of reflective sense of happiness. How happy do I feel with my life rather than maybe from moment to moment? Because that's very subject to whatever is happening around you.
Right. So I would say for me, as you said, the reflective sense, talking about happiness as a whole would be, if I'm working with someone or for someone, if I'm making an impact, if I'm talking to new people every day, if I'm
Mm,
discovering different parts of life, different domains of life. So I think that would be my happiness.
yes. Yeah, totally. Totally.
So, what in the first place intrigued you to study about happiness?
So my background actually, before I got into the job that I'm doing right now, my background is in marketing strategy. And so I started with an advertising agency more than 10 years ago in Amsterdam, where I'm from originally. And then I moved with them to other places. I lived in New York and I worked there for them. I did that in Chicago and then eventually in Singapore. And then finally I moved to Saigon, where I live right now in Vietnam. And in that role, basically, my job is to advise clients, so big brands and sometimes like smaller local brands as well, on how to craft stories that would convince consumers to buy their products. And really, if you think about it, my interest in psychology really comes from there because it really goes into what makes someone tick. What is it that drives someone, not only their decision making, but what makes their life, purposeful, meaningful, interesting? What are the challenges? And so no matter what product you're selling, and I was selling things from simple like soft drinks that you would buy like in a convenience store all the way up to working for big B2B brands. And we were selling to C-level executives, really big implementation projects costing millions of dollars. But even though the products and services were very different that we sold, the challenge for me was always the same, which is basically do research, usually by looking at current research reports, online panel studies, maybe doing focus groups, sitting with people, do research, get to understand this target audience, and think about what is the best story that we can tell them if we want to convince them to buy our product or our service. So it was always about meeting people, trying to understand them, and then that leading to a story that we could then use to sell. So the really interesting thing is that when you're doing that, you're really kind of like not I wouldn't say like abusing, but you're kind of like really digging into something very deep and interesting about those people, right? So like it could be a group of 40-year-old executives, or it could be a group of teenagers. When we're selling soft drinks, for example, you're really digging into not just at a service level, but at a much deeper level. Like what is it that motivates you? What is it that drives you? Right? Everyone knows for example, if you're marketing to children, you always show them like a cooler, older guy or a girl because that's aspirational. That's who you want to be, right? So you're really getting into, again, like sort of like when you think about Daniel Kahneman, much more into the emotional side and into the functional, rational side. And so I was doing that work for more than 10 years, always studying people, always trying to understand like what makes them tick, what drives them, what motivates them on a deep level, and then use that to create a story to sell some product. And eventually I kind of felt like, I think I can do more with this sort of skill that I've gained over time than just sell products. And that's when I really got interested into, beyond sort of like getting to the service of what makes people happy, from a very consumerist side, what drives the real meaning, the longer term meaning, what makes people happy when we talk about that longer term reflective self. So I got really, really interested in finding out what that is, and then not only tell a story, but actually help people. So now that I've figured out maybe what would be meaningful for you, or what would make you happy, how can I then help you to guide you from where you are right now to where your potential is? So that's really where my interest came from.
Lovely. So, before we go on to talk about dream texts, I want to ask you about Bright. So, what was the
Hmm.
aim when you started Bright, or when you even had the idea of doing something like that?
Your questions are so good, and they're so perfectly linear because I feel like it's following my sort of life story. Um, yeah, but basically, literally, where I just left off, where I said, I'm always sitting in groups, doing, like interviews, doing focus groups. I'm learning about kind of like what motivates people, what drives people, what is challenging. It was exactly in one of those moments where I was interviewing a group of young professionals in Vietnam, and hearing about what motivates them, what drives them, but also what are their challenges. That was really the moment where I felt like I want to do something more than use their story to craft some, TVC or some commercial to sell them something. I actually want to like dive much further into this and learn more about like who are these people that they are looking up to, right? Who are these people that they find really aspirational, and what could they learn from them, and how could we sort of like help them grow towards what their potential would be? And Bright was basically, it started as a printed magazine, very odd in these times to do a printed magazine. It started as a printed magazine and then eventually became, also like an online magazine. It became an Instagram. We started making merchandise and products. We did trainings. It really was this whole platform built around young Vietnamese people, the gap between what they wanted to be and who they were right now. And I'm sure that's very similar in your market as well, where there's, for young people, a lot of expectations from parents about what they should become, what should they study, where should they work. And there's this theory in psychology called the Self-Discrepancy Theory, which really is that idea of a gap between what other people want from you, which is your odd self, and what you want from you. And the further you walk away from what you want to fulfill other people's needs and other people's expectations, which could be your parents, which could be society at large, the further you walk away from who you really are and where you would feel like, oh, I'm thriving, I'm flourishing, I'm doing what I want, the bigger that gap becomes, the more anxious you get, the more kind of uneasy you feel in your life because you're not living your own life. And so the idea was, how can we take that knowledge? How can we take those sort of aspirations and those dreams and help people get much closer to that? Maybe they wouldn't quite quit their day job in an industry that they don't want to work, that their parents kind of push them into, which I'm sure you know as well, as things like finance or law or medical, right? Maybe not quite like quitting their day job, but maybe finding a side project. Like there's a lot of like really entrepreneurial people in Vietnam, maybe finding something that they could do that is closer to what really drives them, what really motivates them. So that was really the idea with that platform.
So, do you have any story to share from Bright, or where you were able to create an impact in someone's life, or someone came up to you and said, "Yes, this really worked for me."
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like odd, I think, when you're doing an online platform, that you sometimes have like articles or videos or a piece of content that would literally get like hundreds of thousands or millions of views, but you never have that direct one-on-one story of people, responding to it or reacting to it, other than just generally, it was something for people. What we heard a lot, that when they were scrolling through Instagram, they would see, maybe they're following a couple of influencers, a couple of KOLs, maybe a couple of friends. And of course, everyone, especially influencers, KOLs, but even just regular people, they would always post on Instagram sort of the best things about their life, right? Not so realistic about how life really is. So you would scroll through that and really feel, oh, I don't have that. I don't have that. I truly believe that a lot of unhappiness comes from us comparing ourselves to other people, right? So what we did hear a lot is that like sometimes then something from us came up, and it was always about, hey, focus on what really matters, like live in the now. right? Sort of like reflect on what you really want. Don't worry so much about what other people are doing. And so we got quite a bit of feedback that just having those things in your social feed or coming across an article that someone shared where we sort of like had this inspirational story, it just helped people perk up a little bit. Maybe not quite transformational in terms of like their lives, but it helped in sort of at least having one thing amongst many kind of like sources of information that was positive. But I do think, especially later on when we got more into workshops, which was much less mass, but when we sat around a table with 10 people in a nice, relaxing environment with a lot of like positive images and posters around us, we did hear much more directly about, oh, okay, now that I really get to work on this, I really see the difference. And I think generally, I eventually actually got like my life coaching certification. I think when you get into that, it really, you cannot do that like with a big mass of people. You really have to do it one by one. If you really want to make a difference, you have to sit with someone and say, you've probably seen in all these books and all these magazines and all these like, little videos online, all the theory of how you build a better life, but actually building a better life, putting those things in practice, the only way to do it is to do it, And so sitting with someone and taking them through, I know you've heard the inspirational quotes. I know you've heard the theories of how to but that's very difficult to apply when you have to break through certain things. So when I work directly with people, when we do these smaller workshops, then we got a lot of really great positive sort of stories of people saying, oh, now that I'm actually getting to work and trying to make my life happier, now I'm really seeing, what it can do. So there was much more direct feedback, which was really great to sort of balance that, oh, we can do things to reach like 100,000 people and we reach one person, but it's really impactful. So I think you have to do a bit of both.
So after Bright, how did you hop on to work on Dreamplex, and what made you work on such a different thing than you were working on before?
Yeah, it seems really, really different, maybe in a way. I think for me, it sort of really connects. Maybe it's not like super intuitive, but for me, it quite connects. And I'll sort of like share how the transition kind of happened. So I think I did Bright for about 3 years. And again, we started as a printed magazine, then got much more of an online reach. And then again, eventually we ended up doing a lot more one-on-one work, a lot more doing smaller group sessions. And a lot of what I've learned during that time working directly with people, the kind of feedback you don't get when you're doing online articles or when you're streaming content to people, was this idea of really a lot of the big transformations that people make, or these bigger epiphanies that people have, are at key inflection points in the journey of life. And so I think that, I mentioned sort of these like loops of, you start with kind of like a hypothesis about what life should be. Then you trial and error for a while. Then you have this big epiphany, you jump to another level. And I think that's really what we heard from people. And I think you can map it, at least like in Vietnam, across a couple of key life stages. And one of them is when you get into high school. That's kind of like the first time you're quite conscious about, hey, I'm leaving this kind of environment, I'm moving in this new environment. It allows me to reinvent myself a little bit. I'm sure you remember when you started in a new school, there's this sense of freedom that like, hey, I'm stepping into this like new school. I can be who I want to be. I'm no longer burdened by who I was in this old school, right? And then very similarly, when people transition from high school into university, and then very much when you go from university, when either you do your first internship or when you haven't done that, but you transition from university into your first job, that's a huge inflection point for people. And I kept hearing about that specific transitional point in people's lives where they moved from being in school, which is a very safe environment. All you have to do is show up, in this case, usually on Zoom, so you don't even have to go to a physical environment, but you're really quite safe, right? You kind of like, you're just there to receive, you're there to learn, you're there to absorb. You're not challenged as much as when you go into work. So when people then go from university, either into their first internship or into their first job, there's this huge point where people really have to figure out, who do I want to be? Holy moly, my life is now asking me to define myself again, but all of a sudden I'm not there with just 50 or 100 or a couple of hundred of people that are in the same boat as me. Because when you go to school, you all start in the same year. You have a lot of peers around you that all have, very similar backgrounds. You're at a very similar stage in life. Work is very different because you walk into an office and you have different generations, different characters, different interests, all these different things. And people really have to figure out, oh, within that context, who am I? How am I going to position myself? And you learn a lot of things about yourself that you don't necessarily learn in school when you're just there kind of to learn and to absorb. You really learn to figure out, who am I? What do I care about? And maybe you're confronted for the first time with all of these choices I've made so far in terms of what I was going to study, what I was going to do. They actually don't reflect who I am. So it's really this point where it could sort of create some friction. And so we heard that as like one really big transitional point. And the second one was really around when people transition from their first job into their second job. And usually it is not just because, oh, I want to like move up or I want to learn something new. It's because they've realized something in that first job. They had an epiphany in their first job, realizing that this is exactly what I want to do. I'm going to double down, but I'm going to do it at a different company or in a different role or in a different function. Or it's, I'm in the completely wrong field. I'm going to reinvent myself. I'm going to take this direction. And so while we were working with people on their individual happiness and how could they be happier in life, those two moments of transitioning from university into work and from first job into second job really stood out. And so at Dreamplex, really what we're doing is to design that work experience that allows people to be their best selves, to grow towards what they see as their ideal self, towards something that is really meaningful to them, and to make that day-to-day experience of that journey of learning and growing, which is really what works allows you to do, like nothing else, right? Not at home, not at school. Work is really one of those places and those situations, the context where you can really learn so much about yourself and constantly adjust. And so for me, working on people's happiness and now designing work experience where it's all about helping people learn and grow every single day is actually quite similar. So that's really the transition that I've made in that sense.
Right. So I could totally relate to what you were saying about the transition from school to university, being in a closed environment, and then all of a sudden being exposed to this world which has a lot of expectations from you.
This big scary world.
Right. With lots of expectations and pre-decided norms upon what you have to do and what you shouldn't. So again, hopping back to Dreamplex. So is there any kind of this doubt you have or any fear that you have regarding all the situation going on that remote work might be the future, or like take the case of Airbnb or any or even a co-working space that so is there any fear associated with the co-working spaces that you're working on, or the very fear of the uncertain future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that's really probably in our field one of the hottest topics right now. I was just sharing to you before the podcast, the recording started, but I just finished doing 2 sessions at the Future of Work Asia Summit, and there was a lot of conversation around remote work. Do people want to stay working from home for the rest of their lives? Do companies want people to work from home the rest of their lives? And there have been a couple of companies internationally who have kind of led that idea of, well, maybe we don't need offices. Maybe we don't need physical spaces to work. And I think what we're landing on is that it really depends on who you're talking about. And I think it really depends on the kind of role that you have and the kind of personality that you have and what you want to get out of your work experience. A lot of the things we just talked about are, when we talk about work, we're not talking about the actual job you do. When we talk about the office, we're not talking about just the chair that you sit in and the desk that you sit at. We're talking about this environment, this context where people can either have a great experience on a day-to-day basis or a not so great experience. And anyone who's worked a day in their life knows that, you know, work can be one of those things that is quite universal in the sense that it can be something really great or it can be something really bad. And what is that difference between a great day at work that feels really meaningful, really fulfilling, and a bad day at work? That's literally what my team, I have a team of about 25 people, that's what we study. And we basically study what makes a great day at work and what makes a not so great day at work, and how can we deliver every single day the best possible day for people at work. And in that, we see that work really isn't about just doing the job that you need to do to get your salary at the end of the month, right? Work really is a really sort of important experience that you have in your life, where you get a lot more out of it than just, you know, input is the work you do and the output is your salary. And so we started as a co-working space, which really means that we were a space where people could come in and book maybe 1 or 2 desks for a couple of months and work on some idea that they had. And they didn't have to sit in a coffee shop where they had to worry about ordering a drink every couple of hours, or maybe, you know, they couldn't go to the bathroom because they would have to pack up their laptop. That's really where we started. But I think we, as many of our peers, especially in international markets, have really transformed into a workplace experience company, which means that it's really our job not so much just to provide the physical space and the chair and the desk and the Wi-Fi and the free coffee, but really partnering with fast-growing companies that understand that it's really their people that drive either great results for their company or not. And in that, they typically need a partner, because for young, fast-growing companies, they typically don't have someone, or they don't have the budget, or they don't have the know-how, the knowledge to create this really great environment where people love coming to work. So that's the job that they give to us. They say, yes, of course, we can rent a room somewhere and put a couple of desks in and maybe like hang up a Wi-Fi hotspot. But really what they need is a partner to create this environment where all their employees want to come to work. So when you walk in here, it's the scent that you smell, it's the music that you hear, it's the activity, the buzz that's going on. When you look around, you see the artwork that we actually change almost like every 2 or 3 months to constantly make the space different. It's the trainings that are going on in the space, it's the social activities, the creative workshops. All of these things together create an environment where people want to come to work. And that's really what we do. So in our evolution from starting as sort of like an office that people shared really with the basic functionalities of an office, we now do what we call work experience as a service. So we provide that idea of a great, thriving workplace that's really exciting to come into every single day. And we provide that as a service to companies that have a need. And who are those companies? Well, that is basically every single company that understands that your people are not a cost, they are the real value that you have, right? So when you spend money on your people, that's not money wasted. That is the only real investment you need to make, because your people are your output. So that's really what we do. And so in that sense, do we fear that remote work will take over? I would say not. And I would say not specifically for the reason that even the most introverted people like myself, after staying home for 2 days, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, we start missing that sense of connection. We start missing that sense of belonging. We start missing that sense of transitioning from home life to work life, to going into an environment where other people are caring for you, right? Where other people help you energize throughout the day. There's a lot of research that's been released over the last couple of weeks and months that really shows like how people mostly miss that sense of connection, that sense of belonging, that energy, things that really go down when people are working remotely. There was a recent study from Cushman and Wakefield that showed that really the things that went down were not so much productivity. People talk about productivity. That's not really the thing that suffers from remote working, but much bigger things than productivity, like overall well-being, your physical well-being, your mental well-being. How can you stay sane when you just get up and move like 1 meter and sit at your home desk, right? Things like your sense of learning and your sense of development. right? Your sense of social connection. And those are really the things that you get from a great workplace, in the same sense that when you go to school, of course you go there to absorb some knowledge, but you could get that from YouTube, right? Currently, you're even getting it from Zoom. What makes that experience of going to school great is that feeling of you come in there, you hear the buzz of all the students walking around, right? You know you're gonna see your friends there. You know you have the opportunity to meet people you don't know yet. You're there with like-minded people. Then there is a class. Then there is an extra, maybe like an extracurricular activity you can go to. It's so much more than just the physical space where you get education. So work in that sense is very much the same. And I think there will be more remote work for sure. Companies will downsize how much of office space they need. They will give people the opportunity to maybe work from home 1 day a week, 2 days a week, generally give them more flexibility, more choice. But I don't think the office will go away in any sense.
Right. I believe in the end, we all long for some offline human interaction.
100%. 100%. No matter how fun Zoom is, but we do need to connect with people and not just as something on a screen.
Right. So, how do you think market strategies will change over the years, and what will customers look for while purchasing a product or availing any service?
Yeah, so I can really say it from our side in our industry. I think the big change that will happen when employers think about, what they need, and I think there's so many parallels. The reason that I was able to use my marketing skills or my marketing strategy skills in workplace experience design is really because at the end of the day, it's just about understanding a group of people and then delivering, in that case, it was a story. Now it's a product that aligns with what those people need. And so I think, like there's a parallel to draw between, what I will share from our perspective in workplace experience, probably very similar in what consumers are doing and what people are doing in buying services, which is that I think it's much more about choice. I think the biggest transformation that we'll see, already seeing to a degree now, because Vietnam is still functioning, companies and offices are still open. What I think we'll see in many, many more markets is that there will be a big shift towards choice, towards flexibility, where, I think in the employer-employee relationship, there's really been this big power shift where previously in a developing market like Vietnam, it was really the employer that had all the power, in the same way that big brands in the 50s and 60s and 70s had all the power. You made a great product with a bit of advertising, you could get a product out to millions of people, right? Very similar to like how the power dynamic was between employers and employees in developing markets, where if you had a company and you could hire people, the only thing you needed to do is basically say to people, come work for me and I'll give you kind of like a sense of security. I'll give you a salary, and that's the exchange, right? You come here, you clock in the morning. Sometimes now they do it modern way with a fingerprint scanner in the morning. At the end of the day, you do the fingerprint scanner out, right? And in exchange, I will give you a salary at the end of the month. I think the big shift now, with this whole new generation coming into the workplace, is that the power will be with the employees. The talent market is much more competitive. So all the companies want to go after the same talent. So in the same way that marketing became much more customer centric in this industry or in the world of work, the market will be much more employee centric. And companies will have to think about, what do I have to offer them beyond the salary? That is going to be the big transition that we'll see in the next weeks, months, years, is all about what do I need to offer to an employee to get them to come work for me, and most importantly, to stay work for me. Because companies have usually two key issues. How do I attract the best people, and then how do I retain them, right? Because pitching your employer brand to say, oh, my company is this, can get people into the door. But then from day one, people experience, what is your company really? And that's when people realize that, either it is what they said and therefore I'll stay, or no, this is not at all what they said, I'm going to leave again, right? So attracting and retaining people, that's the key priority for companies. And so from that perspective, it will all be around how do I create an environment that people want to come work for me and want to stay in that role and not leave my company. So attracting and retaining people, it all has to be around developing a proposition, developing a day-to-day work experience that's motivating, that's inspiring, that's meaningful to people. That will be the biggest change in our industry.
Absolutely, I agree. So, hopping on to the topic which attracted me a lot was you read Buddhism. You've been into reading Buddhism. So, what are the things that Buddhism taught
How
you?
do you
And
know that?
well, I did dig into your LinkedIn profile. So, what would you like to share with us the key learnings, or what did it teach you, and how did you go on and implement those in your life and then receive a better outcome?
Oh, we're going deep into Buddhism, no less. Yeah, so I would say that I'm far from a experienced practicing Buddhist. I had been living in Vietnam already a couple of years, and obviously because of that, been exposed to a lot of Buddhism. It really is a big part of everyday life in Vietnam. But it wasn't until I got married, which happened in a pagoda, that I started reading into it much more. And that experience sort of, it felt much bigger than what I had expected, and there seemed to be something there that I was quite curious about. So I started reading about it more. I followed a couple of teachers, and I think that like one of the things that I mean, to me, one of the things that's really interesting is that after reading so many management books, so many books about happiness, so many self-help books, I realized after reading the core, what the core of Buddhism is about, that basically you just have to read that and all the answers are in there, which I'm sure is true for a lot of religious books, because I think that all the modern writing that's out there is just a version of these big ancient truths that people have discovered thousands of years ago. So I think the big truths of life have already been uncovered. We actually don't have to search for them at all. We don't have to read any new books. It's all there. And one of those, I think, probably the biggest things from Buddhism for me is this whole idea of non-self, which really puts a lot of things into context. But maybe on a less deep level, because that goes probably quite far for a lot of people. I think one of the really attractive things about Buddhism is this idea of acceptance, which is really sort of something that you can apply into life. And we talked about happiness earlier. How can you be happy in this world that seems to be full of doom and gloom? It really is just about accepting the things that are. And accepting the things that are then allows you to create a platform for yourself where you can then look out into what are the things that I want to focus on, right? And not being distracted by all these like terrible things that we're hearing every day. So I think acceptance is a really big thing for me. I think another thing from Buddhism that I find very compelling is that concept of it's never the extremes. It's never trying to be this like super amazing, optimistic person 24/7, but it's also not being sort of the depressed recluse that hates everything in life. It's always sort of like in the middle. I think finding the middle has been one of those things that helps so much in life, where, you know, again, we always try to compare ourselves with other people. We feel like, oh, I have to be more like that person. I have to be more like that person. It's not about being on this side of the scale or on this side. It's just finding that middle path. That's been super, super, super helpful. And then I'll pull out one more, which I think helps a lot too, which is this idea of non-judgment. I think one of those like beautiful tenets of Buddhism is not judging. And I think that especially applies to ourselves, because I typically think that we tend to judge ourselves much stronger than we judge other people. So not judging yourself, the idea of self-compassion, I think is one of those things that is so universal. You don't have to be religious. You don't have to, you know, be into that side, that the sort of like the religious side of it, but practicing non-judgment, especially for ourselves, is something that makes a huge difference. And that's what I share a lot, especially in a work context, right? That idea of like, people always say, oh, I'm not good enough to be a manager. I'm not good enough to be this. Look at that guy. Look at that girl. They're better than me. don't judge yourself so harshly, right? You always judge yourself so much more harshly than other people. So non-judgment is another one that I really kind of like live by on a day-to-day basis, and which can be quite transformational as well.
Right. So I was also talking about Buddhism with another guest we had in the podcast. She also pointed out something that really spoke to me was always having the right intent, irrespective of whatever you do. Have the right intent.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, when probably like when you really start reading into it for the first time, and you read about, like turning the wheel and the importance of right intent, I mean, it's 100% true. And I think it fuels so much of your day-to-day life. It's not, about people look usually on the things that people can see on the outside, right? So in Buddhism, that would be things like right speech or right view. But I think right intent is actually much more core to how you are in day-to-day life, because you start with a certain intent, with a certain idea, is a very strong place to start. Yeah, I would totally agree with that too.
Right. So hopping on to the two questions I have for you before we end the podcast. So
Sure.
are you ready for the drill?
I'm ready.
Okay. So the question is, what is the best advice that you've got either in your personal life or your professional life, which you would like to share with us by summing up into a 5 to 7 word presentation title?
Oh, I can probably sum it up into even less words, because the best advice I've ever gotten is actually from my wife. And she saw me struggling. When she met me, she saw me kind of like struggling, trying to be everything, trying to do everything, trying to be the happiest person in the world, trying to always uplift everyone around me. And she said three words that I still remember. I repeated it at my wedding. She said, "Don't try much," which is really her way of saying is that, you know, if you are more core to who you are, if you just take that break to sort of like look inwards and see who you are, that is enough. You don't always have to be more, always give 200, 300%. She said, doing enough is enough. So she said, don't try much. And that's probably still a motto that I live by.
That is
Famous
so
words of
right,
Ming Wen, the wife of Dan.
so beautiful. And another question being, what is the message that you would like to give to all the young aspiring change makers?
Oh, I don't think I'm really in a place to give advice to other people. But if I would have to say something, it would probably be present, which is even shorter than three words. It's only two words.
Right.
Um, I would say it's be present. It's be present in every single situation. We are always finding ourselves in either living in the past, thinking about something that has happened long time ago, or something that happened in something that you just walked out of, or you're at home but you're thinking about what happened at work during that day, or you're thinking about this one bad conversation you had, or we're always sort of stuck thinking about what happened before, or we're stuck in the future where we're worrying about what's going to happen tomorrow. Oh, I still have to pay this bill. Oh, this big presentation is coming up. Oh, I have to do this. Or what will happen if da 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 da. We seem to be so stuck in either things that have already happened and things that still have to happen in the future. And so, I mean, it may sound really simple, but it's probably the hardest thing to practice in life, which is just to be present. There is this really great book, which again borrows a lot from Buddhism, by Eckhart Tolle, called The Power of Now, which I'm sure you've heard about. And the core lesson there, you can skip the whole book if you don't want to read it. The core lesson there is all we have is now, right? Going back to Daniel Kahneman's idea of 500 million moments in life. Life isn't what has happened, what still needs to happen. Life is what happens right now in this moment. And being present for it, being in the moment, allows you to actually enjoy your life rather than always being in thought, thinking about something that has happened or something that's going to happen in the future. And so I would say that if I could give any advice, but again, I don't think I'm in a place to give advice, but if I should give any advice, it would be to just be present.
Right. So, thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for having this great conversation with me, from covering everything to happiness, bright, dreamplex, Buddhism. Thank you for the time.
It was a wild range of topics, I have to say.
Right.
Well researched too. Thank you for your time, and thank you for doing this project, and thank you for taking the time. I'm sure you could have just as easily just been a student and just do the things you need to do, but dedicating so much of your time on helping people take action and actively trying to make the world a better place. We need more people like you. So thank you, first and foremost, for doing that and for bringing that to so many people around you. It's really very admirable to see young people like you doing those things.
As again you mentioned, it boils down to happiness. That what gives me the purpose and the happiness.
Keep going and
Thank
be
you.
present.
Right.